Okay, this is the introduction, so you don't have to interpret this bit. I'll tell you about the subject and give you a couple of ideas of what I might mention. I'm going to talk about ties and wearing a tie, as I am. I'll mention Croatia. I'll mention mercenaries. And the only other thing I might mention, which is a word you might not be familiar with in English, is a cravat, but I'll be explaining what that is. And I'll start in a few seconds. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, times are changing and so are our dress habits. But I think nowadays and for the foreseeable future, regardless of where you are in the world, if you have certain types of jobs, or if you're going to an important meeting or any kind of formal event, if you're a man, you're likely to have to wear a suit or a jacket with a tie. That's true wherever you are, whether you're in China or somewhere else in Asia, whether you're in Africa, in the Americas, or anywhere in Europe. Of course, many parts of the world and many individual countries have their own national dress, and it is possible to wear the national dress on formal occasions or in some workplace situations. But by and large, I think that if you want to look smart and professional, you still have to wear a jacket and tie in most circumstances if you're a man. And indeed, if you had to choose, because it's very hot and you don't want to wear a jacket, you could probably get away with not wearing a jacket, but just wearing a tie if you wanted to look smart and professional. I personally found it hard to get used to wearing a tie all the time, and I'm sure a lot of people really rather hate wearing ties. And perhaps you've wondered why you have to wear these horrible, constraining, and rather uncomfortable things. And what you may not know is that if you want to find where the origins of the tie are, you have to go to Croatia. Croatia is a small European country. It's a member of the EU. It has a population of about 4 million people. As an independent country in modern times, it only became independent in 1991 and it joined the EU in 2013. As it happens, part of the traditional dress for Croatians, for men, going back hundreds of years, involves wearing a scarf which is tied in a very particular way. And this scarf is usually nicely embroidered, very colorful. It's a very nice traditional dress, and the scarf is an important part of it. The other thing about Croatians in history is that the Croats were known as very fierce fighters. They were particularly good, apparently, in the cavalry. And they spent a lot of time in medieval times and afterwards fighting various other nations, including particularly the Turks. And at one point, they were in the Habsburg Empire, the Austro Hungarian Empire, as it later became. And they fought for the Habsburgs and became quite famous as very good soldiers. In particular, during the 30 Years' War, they were quite noticed in other parts of Europe. The 30 Years' War, in case you haven't heard about it, lasted 30 years, as you'd expect. It was between 1618 and 1648. And it involved a lot of fighting all over Europe, particularly in Central Europe and Eastern Europe. And it devastated large parts of Europe. The 30 Years' War was basically a religious war between Catholics and Protestants, but I'm not really going to talk about it, except to point out that it's the only major European war where neither the British nor the French were involved, which is quite remarkable. And that in itself is a good reason to remember the 30 Years' War. But as I said, Croatian cavalry were very conspicuous on a number of battlefields during the 30 Years' War, fighting on the Austrian side. And even though the French weren't involved, the French king apparently noticed how good the Croatian cavalry were. And he decided that he'd like to hire some of these people to be part of the royal bodyguard at Versailles. Just in parenthesis, if you were a king back in those days, you needed a reliable bodyguard because bad things could happen to kings if they weren't careful. And you couldn't always rely on the local people to protect you, particularly if you were a French king. In fact, if you wanted somebody reliable in France, I hate to say this, but you probably had to import foreigners to do it for you, particularly in terms of the royal guard. Over different periods of time, French kings have had Scottish and Irish guards as part of their personal bodyguard. And it's not just in France. The Pope still has a Swiss guard, and the Swiss guard originated as mercenaries from Switzerland who were the most reliable people to protect the Pope. Because, let's face it, if you lived in medieval Italy, you might not be entirely happy relying just on the local people to protect you and to do what you ask them to do. Hence, the importance of mercenaries. If you pay mercenaries well, they are reliable. And because they are not involved in local politics, they will stay loyal. And because they have no particular interest and they depend on the king or the Pope for their pay, they will protect the king or the Pope. So mercenaries were very widespread throughout European history. And so the King of France had some Croatian mercenaries. When they arrived at the Palace of Versailles, people admired their uniforms and particularly their scarves. And it's important to point out also that at this time, the uniforms of soldiers, and particularly officers, were very uncomfortable, very stiff, and usually involved a very high collar under your neck or under your chin that was actually quite painful to wear. So I think the idea of having a soft scarf around your neck to protect it against the collar, and a scarf that also looked very good, was naturally welcomed by officers and by other military personnel as soon as they saw what the Croats were doing. And so officers started copying the knotted scarf Croatian style, and then people in Paris, elegant people, started doing the same thing. And because this was a knotted scarf, knotted à la Croate, if you say it quickly in French, you realize how it sounds a bit like the French word for tie. And indeed, the Croatian word for Croat and also for tie is very similar to the way we pronounce the word cravat, or cravat if you're French. And it's the same thing in a number of European languages, because that's where the tie came from. Now, after the French Revolution, the aristocrats and the officers went to Britain, and Britain, or rather London, became the cultural and the elegant capital of Europe. And that's where new ways of dressing were developed. And the British adopted the French scarf with the Croatian tie. And though they initially used the term cravat, which still exists in English, they gradually modernized it into what we recognize as the modern tie, tied in the way we wear it. And they also adopted, as you know probably, the modern suit and the jacket with a tie in the way we still wear it nowadays. So there you go. That's how we ended up wearing ties. And just for once, it's not entirely the fault of the British. If you're really unhappy about wearing a tie, blame it on the Croats.